Hi, everyone. So, in today's lecture, we are going to be looking at science and skepticism. And we're going to be looking at these both in terms of how we get information about the world. So, I want to start by talking about grimoires. So, grimoires are spell books, right? Or a textbook of magic. And within them, they have explanations on how to perform magical spells or summon supernatural entities, create magical objects, etc. Right? Now, these things aren't just works of fiction or just don't exist in works of fiction, right? You just don't see these in movies or TV or in books. But there are many examples of real life grimoires that we can find that have been produced throughout history. And there's some examples right there. And I want to focus on one in particular. It's called Powwows or the Long Lost Friend. So back in the 1800s, I think this was written in like the 1820s. If you were living in an area pretty close to probably where you live now or where campus is, right? You might have come across this book. Now, Powwows is written by a guy named John George Homan, who was a Hexenmeister or a practitioner of Pennsylvania Dutch folk magic. So, German immigrants came over and settled in southeastern Pennsylvania. Their descendants are some of the Amish and Mennonites that you might be aware of in that area now, but also Lutherans and etc. And some of them brought over this practice of this folk magic that they did, right? And it was some of those spells were written down in this book called Powwows. So if you were living in that area in the 1800s and you had some ailment, or maybe your cattle got lost, or you were going on a trip, you might consult this book for information on what to do as a remedy. So there's examples, right? If you wanted to bond with your dog, for example, you would take some of your blood and mix it in with his food, and then that dog would be bonded to you. If you had a cold, you might take off your shoes and stockings or shoes and socks, run your fingers in between all your toes, and then smell them, and that's going to cure you of your cold. Now, if you were sick today and you wanted a treatment, and if you had the options between this one, right? So every evening, taking off your shoes and socks and running your fingers between your toes and smelling it, or taking some sort of medicine, what option would you take? Now, I believe almost all of you, I think all of you should take the medicine option, right? You're going to take, whatever sickness you have, you're going to take, NyQuil or Tylenol or maybe an antibiotic if it's something like that. And you probably wouldn't do this remedy. But I'm going to ask you why, right? Why wouldn't you? And it may seem clear to you now because this seems ridiculous. Rubbing your fingers between your toes and smelling it is going to fix you. But why is that, right? And so if we got down to it, I think maybe some of your answers would be, well, that medicine is going to be prescribed by a doctor who has a lot of knowledge, right? A lot of training. But I mean, I could probably argue that maybe that John George Holman was an educated man, and maybe if I'm telling you this remedy, I have a pretty good education, so we could probably make an argument against that. But maybe some of your other answers would be, well, we know that medicine has been tested, right? We know that to even get it marketable, there has to go through a series of trials. And then you know that that medicine has been used on other people. And perhaps in your own life, you have taken medicine and it has gotten you better, right? So you are basing your knowledge on that observation and experimentation and testing. And that's really important, right? Because you are using what we refer to as empiricism. And this is knowledge derived from the senses. And this is a fundamental aspect of science, right? And science is based on this idea of empiricism. And it's like I said, you get your knowledge from your senses. So you get your knowledge from observing the world and trial and experimentation. And why this is so important is because even without you maybe recognizing empiricism, you are using it in your everyday life, right? Just like we talked about with this aspect of a cold. And this is because this idea of empiricism and the concept of science and using science is so ingrained in our world today that we may not even recognize it, right? And it's just like I talked about there. This cure, right, that's found in powwows may seem ridiculous to you, but I'm arguing that it seems ridiculous to you because you've grown up in this world of science, right? Where you want to know, you're just not taking things at face value in terms of how they're going to affect the physical world, right? If we're claiming this is going to be a cure, you want to know, has it been tested, right? Have we seen this effect on other people? And that is really directly a result of you growing up in a world of science. Now, if you were back in the 1820s, science wasn't popularized in the United States by that point, or especially in this area. So you wouldn't even have that mental framework, right? So if you were given the option between this, smelling your fingers after they've been in your toes, or some sort of medicine or herbal remedy, you don't have that framework to be like, oh, should what has been tested, right? And that's a kind of an important point to make, right? Without that even concept of this is how we get information about the world through observing it in trials, you're not able to make a judgment as to whether one is better than the other. Um, so that's really important. It's one of the things that I want you guys to think about going forward. And, something that you may not recognize how ingrained science and scientific thinking is in your world. So, I mentioned a couple times what exactly is science, right? So, it is both a body of knowledge. So, it's this collection of knowledge that we have about the world, about how the world works. And it's also importantly a method, right? It's a method of gaining that knowledge. And as I'm going to argue, or I kind of already argued, that it's the best way that we can learn about the natural world, right? That's not to say that other ways of getting knowledge aren't good, right? Or other modes of philosophy or religion, etc. They all have value, right? In some sense, or folk knowledge, etc. But if we're going to learn about the natural world and how the natural world works, I believe, and I think many believe, that science is the best method to do that. So what is this scientific method? You probably all are familiar with it. You've heard about it. You've studied it in school. You learned about it in high school and before. But it's really a series of steps that help you assess or help you determine really what's going on in the world, right? And it starts with a simple thing. You're going to ask a question, right? Something you're interested in. Maybe could be anything, right? How does temperature affect how my plants grow? Um, do that might be a coyote there or a wolf? That's maybe a coyote. Have coyotes increased their range in this area? Um, Anything, right? Any sort of question that you're interested in. And then from that, you formulate a hypothesis, right? And that's really important because that's going to be more of a formal statement of what you think is going to happen, right? So if we're talking about plants, it may be that my plants are going to germinate faster if they are grown at a warmer temperature than a colder temperature, right? That's my hypothesis. And then you test it, right? So that's the other important point. So now you're going to grow your plants at those two different temperatures, and you're going to test and see if there's a difference. And you see if there's a difference by analyzing your results. And in science, we use a branch of mathematics called statistics that is all about analyzing data, right? So that's the scientific method right there. Pretty simple. There are also some considerations that go into it, right? First is that your hypothesis must be falsifiable. And this is important because we're not proving, when we're doing a scientific experiment, we're not proving a hypothesis, but we're disproving other hypotheses, right? That kind of sounds a little funky, but in the case of our plants growing at different temperatures, right? Our alternative hypothesis is that there will be a difference in growth with plants grown under warmer temperatures versus colder temperatures. Now, we would also develop something called a null hypothesis, which is if there's no effect of temperature, right? And that null hypothesis would be that there's going to be no difference in plants grown at warmer temperatures versus colder temperatures. And when we're actually doing our experiment, what we are doing is we are testing to see whether we can disprove that null hypothesis. And it seems kind of kind of weird to think about it like that, but it's an important aspect of science, right? When we are doing experiments, we're not proving our hypothesis necessarily, but we're disproving the null hypothesis, right? So if we grew our plants and we had the ones that grew in under warmer temperatures grew a lot taller than the ones or bigger than the ones under colder temperatures, we're not necessarily going to prove that temperature had an effect because there could be all these other variables potentially, but we are going to prove that the null hypothesis is false, right? The null hypothesis is saying that there's no difference, right? So we can definitively show that there is a difference. We can't prove that that difference is due to temperature per se, but we can prove that there is a difference. And that's seems kind of strange, but it is an important aspect of science, right? We are disproving or accepting the null hypothesis. And this is related to that second idea that I have there of confounding variables, right? So there may be variables other than the ones that you consider that are affecting your outcome, right? So if I'm growing my plants under these different temperatures, there may be differences in air circulation or the amount of carbon dioxide in these different areas depending on where I'm growing them. Maybe I use a slightly different soil or there's different nutrient concentrations that could all affect the growth of these plants besides just temperature. And we call these things confounding variables. So when we're doing an experiment, we try and keep um, the experimental conditions equal between both groups, right? So if I was growing these plants, I want to have the same soil, right, or soil type. I want to have the same amount of nutrition or nutrients. I want to have the same type of atmosphere, right? Because these are other things that could affect the growth of our plants besides what we're interested in, which is temperature. So we try and control things or keep things equal to prevent confounding variables from having a large effect. But we also use iteration, and iteration is just another word for repeats or repeatability, or we repeat things, right? So within a study, we use replication. So if we're growing plants, we want to test temperature. We're not just going to grow one plant under warm conditions and one plant under cold conditions. We're going to grow multiple plants, right? And that is gonna, so if we see that effect among multiple plants, again, it is gives us more likely that we are seeing an effect, right? Because there could be some random variation between just single plants that causes them to grow differently. We also repeat studies for the same reason, right? The more we repeat things, the more data we collect, generally the more sure we can be that we're seeing some sort of effect. And because of this, science takes time, right? And we get more accurate as we do more studies. And sometimes this could be um, discouraging, possibly, or it could lead to some confusion, especially, think of the pandemic that we have right now, right? If you look at the initial information coming out in the beginning, that information has changed through time. And it's not to say that, we were wrong in the beginning or we shouldn't have been listening to people in the beginning, etc. But as we do more studies, we get more information and we get more accurate. And that's just the nature of this, right? And also in this case, the virus has changed, etc. But as we do more studies, as we get more information, we are going to get more accurate. And that's related to this whole idea of science, right? Because like I said, with confounding variables, there's a lot of things that can interact. The world is very complex. There are a lot of these variables that can interact to affect things. So as you do more, you kind of get more accurate in your results. Now, that is all just a general overview of science. And like kind of the point of that, as I said, was to show how important science is in understanding the natural world. And really, even if you're not a scientist or maybe you're not huge into science, etc., um, just that idea of empiricism and using knowledge of that you get from your senses and observation experimentation is somewhat ingrained in your way of thinking, whether you kind of recognize it or not, right? So it is an important concept. And the second half of this lecture, we're going to talk about skepticism. And they're kind of related, right? Because to be a good scientist, you need to have a little bit of skepticism, right? Or just a questioning attitude. You don't want to take things on face value, right? You want to see, again, is there data that supports this? Has there been observations and experimentation that supports this? And we're going to use that right? We're going to use this skepticism. We're going to use what we've learned about science, right, and how basing our knowledge on the natural world, about observations, etc., to now assess information. And this is really important because um, you all have access, we all have access or greater access to more information than in any other time period in history, right? Really, thanks to the internet, you have at your fingertips, on your phone, you have an immense access to information. The downside to all of that is that all of that information is not equal, right? Some is more accurate than others, some is more biased than others, some is misinformation, right? It's deliberately wrong. And the thing is, now it's up to you as the consumer of that information to be discerning, right? You need to have the skills to know, you know, is this news article deliberately trying to mislead? Or is this paper accurate? Or are there flaws in this, etc.? So you now have to develop these tools and this critical thinking to be able to really assess information. So that's what I want to talk about these next couple slides, and I'm going to give you some tips to do that. Right. So these are tips for evaluating information, and it's gonna. A lot of this is related to news sources that you may see or news articles, but it can be used really for anything, right? So the first tip is to evaluate the quality of the source, right? If we were talking about websites, um, what does that website look like, right? Is it does it look like a? And now again, when I say tips, these are not 100% all the time, right? But in general, how's the website look? Does it look like a quality established website, or does it look something pretty low quality, right? Kind of sketchy. How long has the source been around? If it is an organization that has been around for a long time, generally, um, it is that more established organization is going to be um, producing or have things in place that or procedures in place that makes them less biased, or at least produces quality information. Another really important thing is, how does that source make you feel? Right? Media organizations want you to read their publications or click on their publications. And the easiest way to do this is to elicit an emotional response. Think about all those clickbait things, right? What they're trying to do is elicit some sort of emotional response to you. Because if that headline makes you enraged or shocked or curious, etc., um, you are going to be more likely to click on it, right? And look at those examples that I have down there. Millions of Americans are about to be homeless and it's totally preventable. That should make you somewhat upset, right? So you're going to click on that. I mean, why are we, if this is something preventable, why are we letting all these people become homeless? Um, Red alert. Fast track COVID-19 vaccine could lead to massive death rate of 80%. That is designed to scare you, right? Especially if you're already have some concerns about the vaccine, you read that, that's going to scare you. You're going to click on that. Both of these are trying to influence your emotions. So you should be wary if you see a headline like that, right? Because they want you to click on it. Investigate bias. Again, this is related more towards news organizations, but every news source is going to have some sort of bias, right? Some sort of political bias and leaning in one way, right? Now there are resources that are available that track that political bias, right? All Sides is one that kind of looks at these different media resources and where they may fall in terms of left, right, or center. But if you didn't have access to this, another thing is, if you're a frequently consumer of one particular news source, are they always in favor of one party, right? Do they never criticize one party? That's going to be a big tip off, um, as to whether they are pretty biased or not, right? If they're always in favor of Democrats or they're always in favor of Republicans, they never have a bad word to say about either one. That is usually a pretty big sign that they are a biased organization. And then this is really important because this is kind of what we talked about with science, right? Look for data. We just spent that first half of this lecture talking about the importance of science and experimentation and data and learning about the natural world. So look for that data in your news sources or in your information sources. Does the data support their position? Right? Is data biased? Is it peer reviewed? This is important too. If you are looking at scientific journals, there's a process of getting your results published. And if you're going to a journal, that journal is peer reviewed, most of them. What that means is that other scientists are essentially looking at your work and looking for flaws or making sure your work is accurate. So it's like a checks and balances or a QA QC aspect of getting your work published. And that's important because as we're going to look later on, we're all a little biased. We all make mistakes. Having people check your work is helpful, and it ensures that the that body of knowledge of science that we are putting out there is generally more accurate. So check for peer reviewed. In some cases now, especially with new stuff like with COVID, studies may come out that are not yet peer reviewed, and we're putting that out there because we're trying to get as much information out about this thing as possible. But that is something to be wary about, right? If things aren't peer reviewed, it hasn't gone through that normal process of that normal quality control process. So look for data. Like I said, is the data biased? There should be in any news or article, if they are making statements about data or quotes or whatever, there should be links to that data, right? So make sure that they're in there. If you have an article that is spouting off something about whatever it may be, and it's giving you like 50% of these people do this, look to see if there is a link to the actual study that shows that. That's important. So check your primary sources. That's what I'm talking about there. Uh, there is a website, Sci-Hub. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but it is a workaround to get access to journal articles. It was um, the legality of it is probably in question. I don't know if the legality of it, or I know it is not liked by journals, right? Because to get access to a journal article, you have to pay. But if you are a student, especially this was started by a PhD student who was in Europe, and she could not get access to articles that she needed for her doctoral degree, and it was super expensive. So she started this website that essentially is a workaround to give you access to free articles. So again, if you need to look for sources, that is a resource that you guys can use. So besides looking to find the data, now you need to have some idea of, um, is the data biased or are they presenting the data in a harmful way or a misleading way? And one of the big ways that people can do that is by correlation, right? So correlation is not causation. If you've ever taken statistics, you've probably heard that before. And what this means is that sometimes there could be a relationship between two variables, but it doesn't mean that one is causing the other. And an example here is ice cream sales and number of people sunburned, right? So as ice cream sales increase, the number of people that are sunburned also increases. So this could be misleading, and you may be wondering, uh, is ice cream affecting sunburn? Is it making people more likely to be sunburned, etc.? No, right? These two are correlated, and the real cause of this is dry, hot, sunny summer weather, right? Because as the weather gets warmer and nicer, people are going to want to eat more ice cream, and they are going to be spending more time outside, right? So the true cause of this, your ice cream sales and your people sunburn, is the sun, right? And warmer summer weather. These two just happen to both be caused by that one thing, and there's a correlated relationship between them. So this is kind of an easy example, but this can be done and this could be misleading in a lot of ways, right? Just because we see some sort of relationship between two variables, it doesn't mean that one is causing the other or vice versa. So something to be aware of. Another tip for evaluating information is to assess the qualifications of the experts, right? So this is done a lot in propaganda pieces or pieces that are deliberately designed to mislead you. And what they will do is they will have experts talking about something, right? Whatever it is. But often they are not experts in that field in which they are talking about. So it's very easy to put on a fancy title like a doctor and talk about something, um, because we tend to think, oh, they're a doctor, they've had all this education, but it's not. It can be misleading. And a great example that I have is, um, it's kind of past nowadays, but especially when I was younger, there was a huge pushback against teaching evolution, um, by more evangelical Christians, right? So they there was this large pushback against evolution, um, and that it shouldn't be taught, or that intelligent design or creationism should be taught as well. There's still that still goes on, but it seemed to be more common when I was younger. And the people who were proponents or were against evolution would put out, propaganda pieces essentially, um, and they would use this sometimes, right? And a great example I had is I saw a video one time where it was a video against evolution. It was all about intelligent design, and on the video, right, it was a DVD. So I'm older, right? So it's when we still had DVDs. I remember VHS tapes too. Um, so when we saw a DVD, and on it, it was like, whatever the title was, I don't remember, but it would be by Dr. Ben Johnson, right? And so if you are just a casual viewer of this, you may think like, oh, this is written by a doctor, and you're probably thinking he's probably a doctor in this field, etc. So I should listen to him. He has some credibility, or he has some knowledge on the topic. But if you investigate Dr. Ben Johnson, you would see that Dr. Ben Johnson, and this was real in this thing, although Ben Johnson wasn't his name, he was a dentist, right? So he did have a doctorate, but it was in dentistry. And here he was talking about evolutionary biology. So they didn't say that he was a dentist, right? They didn't, that wasn't, putting on the cover that he was a doctor of dentistry. But they want to use that title of doctor because if you don't investigate it, you're going to think, oh, obviously he's an intelligent man and he's has knowledge in this topic. So it's just something to be aware of, right? That if they are talking about their titles, just investigate their title sometimes, especially if you see some of these other things that are coming up, right? That we talked about, because this is something that people do use to mislead you. And the last thing I want to talk about is for evaluating information is that you need to know yourself, right? We all have confirmation bias. And this is essentially the difference between can I believe this versus must I believe this, right? We all have inherent bias and we have inherent ideas about how the world works or what something is. And it's like I said, it's almost inherent and it's without you even know. It's almost subconscious, right? Um, I read a book about like morality and where our morality comes from, and the thesis was that it's mostly emotional, and then your brain works as a lawyer to justify it, right? So you may see something and you have this almost subconscious feeling that that is wrong, and then your brain acts to try and justify as to rationalize why that is wrong. And that is essentially what happens with a lot of information or this confirmation bias. You have an idea about how the world works. If something agrees with that idea, you are essentially asking yourself, can I believe this? Right? So if you think that we'll do, because I'm going to talk about Joe Rogan in a second. So we'll do it with vaccines, right? So if you think vaccines are potentially dangerous to young men or boys, if you see information that agrees with that, you're asking yourself, can I believe this? Yes, of course I can believe this. I already kind of think this is happening, and this is just proving that. But if you see information that goes against it, what you're asking yourself is, must I believe this? Right? So that's a much harder criteria to obtain, right? So if you see something that goes against what you believe, it's now, must I believe this? So you're more likely to doubt it or to look for other excuses as to why that information doesn't exist or why that information is wrong. And this is everyone. So I'm going to show the video of Rogan here, and we'll look at that. We'll look at how that works. And this is not to come down on Joe Rogan, however you feel about him. I'm highlighting this because this is a really good example of this, and this is everyone, right? So everyone would have had this reaction that he does, and has that reaction in their day-to-day life. He just happened to have it on video.
Or there's an adverse risk associated with the vaccine. It's like a 2 to 4 fold increase in the instances of myocarditis.
Yes, but you know what?
Hospitalization.
You know that there's an increased risk of myocarditis among that age cohort from getting COVID as well, which exceeds the risk of myocarditis from the vaccine.
I don't think that's true. I don't think it's true. No. I don't think it's true that there's an increased risk of myocarditis from people catching COVID that are young versus increased risk of myocarditis from the vaccine.
No, there is. There's both.
Well, let's look that up because I don't think that's true. Myocarditis more common after COVID-19 infection than vaccination. But is this with children? Yeah, we're talking about young people.
Men and boys aged under 30 after this is what it says here.
With children is the issue.
Well, no, we were talking about 15-year-olds.
Well, we're talking about young children.
Male,
so yes,
12 to 17.
12 to 17, more likely to develop myocarditis within 3 months of catching COVID at a rate of 450 cases per million infection. This compares to 67 cases of myocarditis per million at the same time following their second dose of Pfizer.
Yeah, so you're about 8 times likelier to get myocarditis from getting COVID than from getting the vaccine.
That's interesting.
Now,
that is not what I've read before, but also it's like, even when we're reading these things, it's like, what are we getting this from? Was this from the VAERS report? But even from the VAERS reports, when they report this stuff, it's like the amount of people that report, it's the underreporting.
Okay, so we just saw that example right there. And what's happening is that, he has this bias already, right? And that is because of what he read before. And I remember watching the episode where he read the initial article that he is talking about, or he kind of references before. And he has this bias that young men or boys are more likely to get the myocarditis from the vaccine than from COVID itself. And he gets fact-checked live during his podcast, and it's the other way around, or that's what the study is showing, that it's actually the other way around. But then look at his reaction after that, right? It's not like he doesn't just accept it, right? Because it's going against his bias. He's going to say, well, that's not what I read before, and, where are we getting this information, right? It's a much harder criteria for him to accept that because it's going against his innate bias. So again, this isn't to just point out Joe Rogan, right? It's cool that he actually put it up on Twitter and he can almost make fun of himself. But this is something that is that all of you would have that same reaction, and you probably do in your day-to-day life when you come across information that goes against what you believe. So it's something to be aware of, right? Besides all these other tips that I talked about, looking at the quality, are they appealing to your emotions? Is there data? What are the experts? Know yourself, and know yourself that you have this inherent bias as well. So that is it. I will see you guys next week.